Hello and welcome to Builders, the podcast about the people shaping the future of work, technology, and leadership. I'm Lee Haynes, and today I'm joined by Alexandre Paternoster, Senior Manager in the Digital Strategy Group at KPMG Netherlands. Alexander brings a unique blend of technical expertise and strategic vision, helping clients navigate the increasingly complex intersection of digital transformation, AI, and organizational change. In this episode, we'll explore why he sees AI not as a revolution, but as a continuation of digitalization, and how it can unlock productivity while keeping people at the center of the transformation. We're going to have lots to talk about, so let us dive in. Alexander, a pleasure to have you with us. How's it going?
It's going great. It's a pleasure to join the podcast.
Thank you very much. Let's start with your journey. How did you find your way into digital strategy? What led you to your current role at KPMG?
That's a long story. Mm-hmm. Let's say I was interested about engineering and science. So my background was studying engineering, studying materials, carrying on with doing more research and a PhD. And in my first real job, I joined a company as a structural engineer, and I worked my way up, gaining more responsibility, delivering more projects. And I stayed there for 9 years. And what was fascinating to me is that my work as an engineer drastically changed over those 9 years. It was not only sufficient to deliver engineering project, design of a product, it needed to be done with more and more digitalizations. And by the end of it, so as I got the responsibility, I was leading a team to do material qualifications. We were not only delivering results, but we were also delivering data sheets. We were automating processes. So it was a complete and fairly progressive transformation from purely engineering parts to also digitalization. So at one point I realized actually digital is a really important domain I like to understand better and also align with company strategical goal. And there was an opportunity open at KPMG to join the digital strategy team. So I applied, got the job, and for the past 3 years I've been at KPMG doing various projects, more at the strategical level, but that doesn't prevent me from also having project with a bit more technical content and technical expertise.
Got you. And what does your day-to-day look like as a senior manager in the digital strategy group? What types of clients are you working with? What types of problems are you typically working on?
So I'm going to distinguish the project I'm currently on with the generic, let's say, the day-to-day work. So typically, we work with a number of clients at a time. We are spending quite a lot of time going to the client, listening to their challenges, assessing, or to best restructure the organizations to answer the client problem and make their operating model work better for them. And in the current project I'm on, it's a large data migration project. I'm part of the management team structuring the work of roughly 100 of software engineers and BA analysts. So that's why it's important to distinguish a role. You can have multiple hats, and when and in the typical digital strategy work, it can be with any size companies. I worked with small, medium, and large company. So as you can imagine, it can work at different levels as well. Sometimes the question is bound to an IT department, or sometimes the questions is for the entire company organization.
And when you've been working with these companies of different sizes, and particularly when guiding large organizations through digital change, what have been some of the biggest leadership lessons you've learned?
That's an excellent question. I would say listening is, and this will come back, I guess, a bit later in the conversations. But for me, it was listening and understanding what is the specific challenge of that stakeholder at this level. And you quickly realize that his perception and his problem can be very different than people on the workflow or operating within his department or even in the next department. So organizing all of those different voices and creating structure is really important, because then at one point you will need to you're gonna study very hard. You're gonna have all those feedback from different parts of the company, and you need to bring that up into a coherent change process. And that can be quite difficult, as you can imagine. But it's part of the fun, is figuring out what will work for all the stakeholders.
Yeah, and I think it's you make a really interesting point there, like the number of different stakeholders, essentially, because I think there are different studies that talk about how I think it's around a third of digital transformation efforts succeeding. So, like, I think they mentioned the primary reasons for those that don't exceed being this kind of unclear strategy, like a lack of leadership buy-in, and like cultural resistance. So, like, what are the most common roadblocks that you see in enterprise digital transformation?
Is the managing the change that digital transformation brings, because it sounds very straightforward to say, oh, we're going to rationalize the type of digital technology we're going to be using, but maybe one of those technologies used by a very specific stakeholder group that without it cannot do their day-to-day work. So going at the different level and hearing those different voices will help you realize that, well, this particular stakeholder need that tool for that reason. And if you do not take care of why do they need that tool, the change is bound to fail. Because they will not accept the solution that doesn't cover their mean. So it may be a bit of a specific example, but that's quite symptomatic of why larger changes can fail or not be completed. And you end up with the opposite of what you started with. Instead of having an homogenized landscape, homogenized vision aligned with the bigger strategic goal of the organization, you still have those pockets of people doing things in their own way, because that's the only way they can fulfill their primary mission.
Yeah. And how easy is it, or like how do you drive clarity and velocity in such a setting? Because I mean, I'm assuming a lot of the companies, the organizations that you're working for or working in, are kind of matrixed organizations where employees might report to multiple managers or teams, often across different functions, across different regions. And in these kind of environments, decision-making cycles can take obviously much longer due to overlapping roles, competing incentives. So I guess it's like a fine balance, right? Where you have this, okay, you need to drive clarity, but also velocity to some extent. So how easy is that, or how do you do it?
And communication is key, right? And sometimes what's very interesting is to ask the simple question: do you know the company's strategy? Do you know your group strategy? And then to report back to the C-level. Well, this is actually how it's perceived. But working on aligning both will help a lot further effort into indeed driving that change, making those big steps, reaching those milestones, and in the end transforming the way the company works.
And what role does culture play in successful digital transformation?
Very. So culture, people are an integral part to to the approach of transforming an organization. If you do not take culture into account, it's going to be, you might have a roadblock as you're thinking about your roadmap, or even as you're operationalizing certain change. It's a bit more difficult to go into a specific example, but you can imagine for instance, in the banking sector, everything is very, very regulated. So the way you operate in that environment is going to be very different than, for instance, if you're working for an engineering company or an hotel group, for instance.
Yeah. And you mentioned the kind of people side of things here. And I'd like to talk briefly just a little bit about building the right teams, because obviously you're probably working across a lot of very different kind of projects, depending on what transformation is you're working on. So like hiring and kind of growing talent that can bridge strategy and technology it's not easy. But can you talk a little bit about what challenges you face here? Are you working with? Are you in charge of kind of recruiting for these teams that are kind of implementing these transformations? Or can you talk a bit about the recruitment side of things here?
Sometimes it's also finding the right people for the right role. So within my team, I'm there's of course day-to-day tasks. So who's gonna operationalize those aspects? Who's gonna support the preparation of high-level documents? And it's a bit of a difficult blend to get deep technology expertise and also the ability to communicate effectively about why that change affect the organization at a higher level, and therefore can impact the company's strategy in positive or negative way. I like to work with people who have a deep expertise, and I think it's easier to work that way because they are confident about their own foundation, and they, most of the time they just need to be given the chance to work on it, to communicate about it. And I also like, because they're usually very enthusiastic people as well. So I try to find what is everyone's expertise, and then to help them grow this expertise, and also do communications further in the company's organization.
Yeah. I think that the reason I ask is that I can only assume that a lot of these digital transformation efforts can fail or stall, not just because of these technical gaps, right, or a lack of technical expertise, but also because of these soft skill mismatches, right? So an inability to influence, or kind of stakeholder empathy, to put it another way. So would, even though you kind of you mentioned that you really like those with technical expertise, are there any red flags or common traps that you see in kind of hiring, or kind of placing people in transformation teams? Or put another way, rather, what skills do you think are essential in such roles? Is it mostly the kind of technical side for you, or?
The communication is another big important aspect. As I mentioned earlier, if you don't have good communications in both direction, you cannot take an organization strategy and then break it down into operational element that needs to be done. So the same is true in reverse. If you've got some people with deep technical expertise, they need to do the exercise in reverse, and not everyone is built to do that, or is even willing to do that. However, it would be a shame to miss an excellent technical person who has also the ability to grow into being a great communicator, and in the end a great strategist. And I don't think there's any school you can take for that. You need to be given the opportunity within the project we have, and that's what I try to give to the people in my team.
Now to talk a little bit about AI. Obviously, we can't have this discussion without talking about it as a topic. And not to put words in your mouth here. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you see AI much more as like an evolution, right, as opposed to a revolution. A lot of people like to put it like that, right? That it's kind of a revolution. But can you unpack that idea for us?
Sure. So I don't want to diminish the huge step we've done in the past years, and the technology is today absolutely incredible. And it seems like every week we've got a new product, a new improvement, and so on. So that we can feel that acceleration. However, I like to put that acceleration into more, let's say, historical perspective. The advent of automation is goes much further back, and in insight there were some technology that we were using 10-20 years ago that now would have the generic label AI. But as a scientist and then as an engineer, I saw those technologies. So now we would call them as closed AI, if that makes sense. But AI meant to process complex data and trained for very particular exercise. And companies needed to adapt to that evolution of technology and that evolution of systems that could process more and more complex data. So nowadays, with tools such as Gemini or ChatGPT, we have the ability to compress very complex data, so speech, text, and transform them into another complex output. But there's clearly a progression. Neural network were already there 20 years ago. Advanced image processing, that was 5 years ago, a bit earlier, depending on what's your criteria. And company needed to adapt to those technologies already.
And how do you guide the companies you're working with? They might approach AI with hype or even with fear, but I guess you're trying to have them kind of approach it with a grounded strategy, right? So how do you do that?
I think it's very important to understand what type of AI you have and to disambiguate behind that generic term what's best for the organizations. So you can have very specific AI model that's meant for instance, in banking to look at credit rating, or for instance, very generic AI, which are going to be summarizing a conversation. So all of those are called AI, but not all of them will match what the company actually needs. So first, it has a lot of communication and explanation about what to label AI, what kind of work do they expect from AI, and in the end, it breaks down to use cases. Listening to what the company needs, what the stakeholder wants, what the stakeholder requires at a different level, and making those tests, those proof of concept. All right, if an AI does that part in that process, or does that work? Does that improve things? Does that make things worse? What kind of handover do you have as a human? What kind of control and risk do you put in place? So it's from that big question: how can we have AI within the organization to help us, having a very structured approach into breaking down what the technology can do, and how can it be used to bring value to the organization?
And can you give any examples of where you've seen the use of AI actually create meaningful gains, be it in kind of productivity gains or whatever?
So the example I have is a bit more related to engineering. But for instance, defect recognitions in a manufacturing process, the use of neural network to recognize and classify defect is an absolute game changer, with a double-digit increase in the amount of defect you can capture and defect you can process. And that's an example of a closed one. Then more recently, the use of ChatGPT and other chat agents within organizations. I mean, if you talk to people, you see that sometimes they're relief about the kind of summary that it brings, the support on taking notes on meeting. So it's hard to quantify what's the gain, but just hearing people being relieved and being able to concentrate on slightly different thing, you cannot ignore that.
And do you think it's being overhyped or misunderstood at all, particularly in larger enterprises?
I'm not sure if it applies to only larger organizations, but I do think AI is being let's say, misinterpreted is probably the right term, and that's why explaining what it is, what it does, and the different sorts of or types of AI is very important. The and again, don't get me wrong, the technology is absolutely amazing. If 5 years ago I would have thought that I could from any microphone I could have a perfect transcription of everything I say with the imperfection in my voice, I would not have believed that. But this is the reality we have today. So it's overhyped in the sense that you cannot replace a complex process with many people involved, with one AI that's going to do it all. However, where it's going to be good at is in the same way when we approach digital transformation is, all right, what do you want to do? What's the process? Where do you place AI in that process? Or does the roles of the people that comes before and after that automated AI part is changing? And it's thinking about all of those that make it work.
So are you still more of the opinion that it's a human-centered AI approach,
Definitely.
essentially? Yeah.
So it also depends on which environment you're operating.
Right.
So if you're operating in a highly restricted environment, you want more control over your AI than in a less risky environment. We receive most of all suggestions for YouTube, TikTok, Netflix from fairly advanced AI. But if the AI fail or get something wrong, you just find it weird in your feed. Your feed, there's no harm, right? But the cost of failing in a banking environment or sending the wrong letter to the wrong client, the impact and the cost is much higher. So you need humans to frame and to manage that risk, and therefore it's quite funny because in the end it gives back the leads on what makes the value of a human in those process. And it's not the boring automation of the task or the crunching through numbers, making assembling a very complex piece of information together. The human is still there for the final analysis, for the final for taking the responsibility of the entire process, where you've got bits and pieces enhanced by the AI.
And I think, you mentioned tools like Gemini and ChatGPT earlier, and how they're changing how meetings are conducted, how documents are kind of put together, but also how decisions are made throughout an organization. Do you think there's a risk of losing this kind of human nuance in decision making as these AI tools are becoming more and more embedded?
I would not say the human nuance, but there needs to be taken for what they are. Great summarizing tool. So if you need to take a decision quick and you've got hundreds of pages of documents, then those tools are great to give you a breakdown of what it is. But you also need to be aware of their limitations. They can hallucinate. They can invent references. They can be inexact, but I want to say, as a human, can be as well sometimes.
Yeah, true.
It's a bit like when we got Google, right? We all found it as a fantastic tool because you could query the entire internet within a couple of milliseconds. But in the end, we learn not necessarily to trust the first link that we clicked on it. Well, we need to do the same thing with those fantastic tools. It's simplified. It brings us back information, but we need to be also critical about that information.
Yeah, that's really, really well put. But I'm also interested to get your take on processes as a whole, because you talk about how AI can will do certain parts of a process, but there's also a lot of buzz around the agentic AI workflows and how agents will be taking care of complete full processes in the future, or are starting to do so now. So what's your take on this? Or is it still very much I mean, it depends obviously on the workflow, the environment, the kind of industry and all of that, but what's your take on this?
That it's going to take a greater part in organization process. And what I think will happen is that if done properly, it puts human to do what humans are good for. It's communicating to another human. So it not only put them at the control side, but it put them also at the part where you're doing handover. There's no point about replacing all the internal communication of an organization so that it becomes a black box with agents. If I would automate the way I send mail, and my colleague would do the same, then at one point we'll have only AI talking to each other, and it becomes an inhuman organizations. So I really hope that we get to see that future where we can have AI agent do the hard part of things and get a different and higher and better informed view to take the best decision possible for the organization we're working for.
And when it comes to responsible AI, is this more like I mean, there's a lot of buzz around this at the moment as well. Do you see it as like a necessary foundation, and how do you help the organizations that you're working with kind of balance innovation on the one hand with risk on the other, particularly around governance and bias or compliance and these matters?
Yes, so that's where having a good operating model where risk and people role to have a strong governance is really important. So it goes into putting a human at the right locations to take the final decision and to in the end own the decision. The last thing you want to do about a company, it's not our fault. It's the AI that we were using that took the decisions. So and that's stayed the same. Successful companies have a good corporate governance structure. They own the risk they're taking. So I think it's similar to the discussion about will AI, what kind of decision can an AI take, and is it safe to have AI take decisions in companies? It all depends of the environment and the kind of decisions, but human must have a role into in the end signing off for where it really matters, where it has impact, where it has consequences for people.
Yeah, I really, really agree there. And in your experience with the companies that you've been working with, where would you say most of them are on their kind of AI maturity curve, if we put it that way? I mean, it's becoming, like I said, it's becoming more and more embedded. There's kind of there's going to be more and more adoption. It's going to be penetrating more and more areas of organizations. Where would you say, generally speaking, they are on their maturity curve?
I'm not sure I've got a good view of well, to speak for companies in general. However, in the company I've worked in, I see very stark differences, and those were culture-based and sector-based. You asked earlier a question about the culture. And if the culture is very tight, the adoption is going to be lower. But same is for other technologies. I'm going to give you an example with, for instance, cloud. For some companies, they simply cannot have their data in any cloud or everywhere. So their adoption to cloud technologies was much later than other companies because they needed to make sure that those safeguards were in place. And the same is happening for AI. In a lot of in some sector, you need to make sure you've got the right to process personal data and that you have the traceability of it. So then having an AI which is a bit of a black box can be problematic because you do not fully control what's the processing of that data is. So it varies a lot. Well, what you see is that in core functions, you definitely have a drive towards specific AI because you can have them on premise. You can train them and have them executed for very, very specific purpose, and they're also easier to verify that the processing is doing the right thing. Then on the office space, we've we are seeing the adoption of the AI associated with typical productivity tool as well, even in control environments. So that has progressed a lot in the past couple of years, but it's all over the place.
And how would you say would you say it's kind of proportionately impacting or kind of augmenting junior consultants in your line of work compared to the more senior ones? Or because it's similar in software engineering and everything like that. It's kind of it has a different impact, if you know what I mean, based on seniority in a profession. Would you say it's the same?
I think that is true in the willingness to try out the technology and the adoption of technology, right. and that was and you can. I like to have historical perspective, but you can put any technology with it, a smartphone, personal computer. It was the earlier you were in your working, let's say, working age, the quicker you adopted the new technology, the younger you were.
Yeah.
So same is true with AI, and indeed, junior people tend to use those tools much more than senior people. But it's interesting because I do think that senior people, they have the experience, they have the knowledge of the sector, they have the knowledge of the organization with and all those processes I was hinted at. So they're also much better placed to design control for those AI and redesign the process with AI in place.
Yeah.
So if anything, it gives an opportunity for cross worker generational discussions.
Yeah, no, really, really, really well put. But looking ahead, Alexander, what's something that genuinely excites you right now in tech? Not because it's trendy necessarily, but because you think it's meaningful. Is it within AI or yeah? What is it?
That's a very good question. So I think it's not directly AI, but it's the tools around AI. And so next to the progress of development around AI, it strongly linked to making tools to make your own models or to retrain data more accessible every year. I'm thinking at when for instance Google released TensorFlow, which was a framework to make your own model, and from that you see an explosion of paper about AI. This year, I would say it's design of agentic platform. It's really impressive what you can do with fairly little knowledge about or to set up a model from scratch, but or you can design agents, make them work together, and trying to achieve a complex task. So I would say the toolings that companies like Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and other smaller one are thinking, designing, and putting in front of anyone connected with to the internet with a laptop.
And a lot of, I mean, more and more workers, are using AI tools, or at least are being encouraged to. But I think a lot of them also crave, or still crave, these kind of meaningful connections with colleagues, but also their managers, and also clarity from their managers on what to use potentially, but also how to use things to the greatest benefit. So I think I'm just interested to hear, if you were to look, say, 2 to 3 years ahead, how do you think the role of human interaction in digitally driven organizations will change?
So maybe let's slice the question into a few parts. So first of all, if you don't say to your employee that you can use the tool or to use it, they will use it. It was very clear when ChatGPT arrived and anyone with a browser could use it. It was used everywhere in all the offices, whether there was guidelines to do or not. So companies, it's one of the first things they should do in the AI adoption journey is adopt guidelines, communicate those guidelines to the to employees, having trainings, workshop, having more senior workers supported by younger workers, more enthusiastic with that technology, and you can imagine all sorts of initiatives to frame the use of AI within an organization. So that's one. Sorry, could you repeat actually the question? I've a bit lost where
I was interested in hearing, if you were to look a couple of years ahead, 2, 3 years ahead, how you think the role of human interaction in these digitally driven organizations will change.
Yeah. So then, having covered the AI part, it makes sense that the role of people within the organization will change in light of around the work that does AI, or even the other way around. You still have people and you make AI work around the people. But I think it will go for the better, because we want to wake up in the morning and be happy to go to work, to have meaningful decisions with our colleague that improve the mission that we have within that organization. So if anything, I think digitalization can bring people closer together.
Yeah, really interesting perspective, because obviously the assumption is that it's going to drive people apart, right?
But I can give you an example in my current project. So it's a large data migration project. So a lot of the work is about placing the right version of the code in the right system so that it does a very specific purpose. And we've automated a lot of those activities so that we have less manual work to do. So we can join a meeting with senior stakeholders and have those discussion. Why do you need that piece of code there? What are you trying to achieve there? And we are a bit at the center of the communication between the teams developing the code and the senior management, but all working towards those strategical goal. And this is an example where automating the day-to-day tasks and the difficult part of the job, but which can be better done by machine, actually makes us spend more times in meetings, trying to understand the client, into supporting the team who are developing the code.
And you just mentioned a project there, and I was going to ask you as one of my final questions. Is there anything that you're working on now, or that you will be working on, in the near future that you're really excited about, that you can talk about here?
So I think that's data migration project, which is quite important for me and the organization. Because in the end, it affects thousands and thousands of people, and I hope they never know that something was done. Because a good data migration project is that the end user never realizes that something changed behind the scene, and that it's fully transparent. So I'm excited about that. I'm excited to lead the team to do the best job that can to serve that greater goal.
Yeah, you're invisible until something goes wrong, essentially, right?
Yes.
Not that something will go wrong. I make it sound like it's inevitable, but no, of course. No. Fantastic, Alexander. Is there anything you'd like to add before I wrap up here?
I was not expecting this one. Yeah. Let's see. I think we've covered quite a bit. I'm glad I could discuss about my viewpoint, or I think digital brings people more together. Maybe it's just going back onto the engineering side of things. I really think that engineering and other functions are elevated by the integration of digital technology. And you can look at the acceleration of progress done in every single field. And most of the time, it's supported by digital technology. The fact that we have more advanced algorithms, we can do more finer analysis, and we can process more and more data every single year.
Yeah. No, I think it's been a really very interesting and very thoughtful conversation. I think you have a very grounded perspective on AI, and I think that kind of emphasis that you have on the human side of transformation offers I think often missing now, but it's kind of much needed lens for people, leaders that are navigating today's digital landscape. So thank you so much for joining us and for giving us that perspective. Really nice to have you with us. And to our listeners, as always, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to follow, to leave a review, and we'll be back soon with more conversations. Until next time, keep innovating and keep building. Ciao for now.